Okay, well, welcome everyone to our webinar sponsored by Trend Data. I'm Jonathan Webster. I'll be facilitating this webinar. Just a couple of orders of business as people are joining here. I want you to be able to communicate with us as you're listening and learning and watching. Please feel free to utilize the chat application that's a part of GoToMeeting. You can just submit any thoughts, questions, ideas that you have during the webinar, and we'll have a question and answer portion at the end, and I'll send those questions on to Tom, and we'll get them all answered for you. All right. Well, with no further ado, let me introduce our speaker. The presenter today is Tom McEwen, with more than a couple decades in the human resource technology space. He's an expert here, and I will allow him to take the floor here and tell us about people analytics and where does the data come from.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's I really appreciate you joining today. I know it's a kind of crazy time right now. As you can see, we're all working from home at Trend Data. You know, in mandate with our city ordinance, and of course trying to keep everybody healthy. So we always like to start off the meetings, at least in the last couple of weeks, where we have our camera on so we can see a few people. If you can't get out and talk to people, at least seeing people is nice. But I am going to turn it off right now because every time I see a picture of me, I think my father's wandered into a demo. So let me handle that right now and I'll begin. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my screen. We've modified the webinar title just a bit from how we publicize it. We are going to talk about data and data sources, but we're also going to cover some of the shifting analytics needs that companies are going to have to endure, at least during this current coronavirus episode, and possibly if that leads to economic downtimes a little bit. What are some of the things you'll need to know and use that might be different from you know, the bull and good times that have been the last couple of years. So as Jonathan said, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Trend Data. There's a picture of me better dressed out in the business world. But I founded the company with my co-founder, Mon Hamden, 3 years ago. We've been selling people analytics to corporations and organizations since then, and we'll go through a few of those things. So a quick agenda, what we're going to cover today. I'll give you a brief background on Trend Data, as I discussed. We'll go through what the different types of data are, and I'll get a little more deeper into that. We'll also address the concept of big data, something that gets thrown around a lot, to give you kind of a definition of just what people are talking about when they use that term. And then we're going to pivot onto you know, what are the key analytics and metrics that our clients track and that we try and target for our deployments, and how those have changed a little bit based on what clients are needing today. And then we'll talk about how technology can help you with this, and we'll end up with a demonstration of Trend Data. Again, in these webinars, we do demonstrate Trend Data, our own product, but we do it more to visualize what we've talked about in the webinar. So we try not to make it a product pitchy demonstration, but just really to illuminate the things that we've talked about. And as Jonathan said, please send your questions via the chat capability, and we'll address those at the end of the session. So as I said, Trend Data, we launched in 2017, a couple of years ago. We're headquartered in Richardson, Texas. If you're familiar with Dallas, it's a suburb in the DFW area. We sell largely to corporate clients, but really anybody who has a workforce is a target for us. Our solution is predictive people analytics, the cloud offering. And really what all that is, I think I have this slide in here twice, so let me come back to this one. Some of our clients out there, we do a lot with the healthcare sector, which is going through some busy times these days. Also, the financial sector has been big for us. We have about 30 clients, and kind of goes across all the different vertical segments out there. We do work and sell through a number of partners. Some of the ones you might have heard are ADP, of course, Deltek, a big HRIS vendor in the engineering and construction environment, Talent Guard, one of the leading talent management firms, and Insala, who actually provide a couple of tools that are going to become more useful, I think, as we go on, and we'll talk about some of those, their alumni and career transition services. So the types of data we're talking about. So essentially, there's really three types of data that clients use or that companies use to process information. The first is structured data, and that's very simply data that has a formatted repository, basically a system that has records in it. So that's typically any large database system, an ERP, an HRIS system, any of the systems that you're tracking information that's record-based. It could also be spreadsheets or flat files, because just the very nature of the cells is record-based as well. So as long as it's record-based and in some kind of formatted repository, that's what's considered structured data. The flip side of that is unstructured data. That's information that doesn't fit into such a conventional data model, such as a database. Some that are commonly used, particularly in the HR sphere, are Word documents. So a lot of companies, less so, but do a lot of performance reviews sometimes just on Word documents. A lot of times they're trying to pull emails into various things to maintain data flow. And then the less and less structured data are things like text, photos, and voice, capturing voice and stuff. Is not really in a structure or format and considered more unstructured data. And what kind of lives in between them, not overly cleverly described, but is semi-structured data. And that's what allows you to basically take unstructured data that has associated information, such as metadata, and make it amenable to a records type processing environment. Some ways of doing this are actually tagging data within. So you see this all over the internet where you have tagged words that you can click on and go to somewhere else, or words that can actually be captured when search engine optimization and stuff goes out there to find things. By tagging these words, you can actually turn structured data into unstructured data. You can also do it in a file-based nature by assigning things like authors and create dates to things like Word files. So if you're able to provide an author to that, you can basically pull that up as a unified record, but still not necessarily everything, all the free-flowing text in between. Yeah, so you've got structured data, unstructured data, and semi-structured data. And for the most part, HR data is, at probably the very least 90% structured data. You're bringing data in from very organized record-based data sources. And that doesn't make it necessarily clean or all the time useful data, but at least that's how it's coming into the system. And kind of pivoting off of that onto, what exactly is big data, is data out there that is kind of a little more all over the place. And there are really 5 V's of big data, will actually describe it. Now, the first one is variety. Usually when you're talking about big data, it's coming from a multitude of sources. So it could be some structured data from internal systems, unstructured data from out on the web. It could be catching little swaths of data from social media and stuff like that, public data. Generally, big data is pulling data from a variety of sources. The next V in the 5 V's of big data is veracity, is basically how much can you trust the data. Again, going back and talking about HR, this isn't quite as relevant because it's not propagandized data. This is mainly talking about things like social media, where you might have somebody putting false data out there, and you're consuming it as fact and putting it into your models and such. Generally with HR data, again, it's coming from structured data, well channeled. So that doesn't mean that the data can't be incorrect. It's just not purposely false. You might have the wrong location, things in there, and that's stuff that will come up to cleaning, but it's not purposely false data. Volume of data is probably the main one. Huge amounts of data. Now, generally, you take a typical HR system, 10,000 employees in it. If you took all the fields in that particular system and all the metrics attached to it, so it might be 300, you could probably fit all that onto a spreadsheet that's probably in gigabytes. And that kind of gives you the idea what sizes of data you're dealing in HR. Usually it's gigabytes, so it's not massively large, but as you start bringing in external data sources, that could grow to a bigger type environment. But compare that to Facebook, which has how many 100 terabytes of data of information, and also how big it is and such. Also a large credit card processing system that's bringing in consumer data all the time. That's a much bigger set of data. And then there's the aspect of velocity. How often is the information changing? There's really two areas of HR data which tend to be changing often, and that's hires and terminations. And even those, depending on the size of your company, 1,000-person company might be hiring 40, 50 people a month. They might be letting go 40 to 50. That's the most month to month that records are changing. When you do performance reviews, it might be once a year, might be once a quarter. And probably the other main one is payroll, which gets updated, usually twice a month or so, depending on the particular company. So velocity a little less in HR, but it has its particular areas. And then the final one for it to be really classified as big data is, does it have value? Do you have all this data? Can you use it and turn it into economic value to the holder? And I think you can pretty much say that HR data, your people data, definitely has value. So so I'd say HR data still talking about big data, but is more, I'd say, almost semi-big data. And the screen that I was about to show earlier talks about how all this data comes into something like a people analytics platform. Typically in an HR environment, there's probably, if you're a company, say over 1,000 employees, and even under 1,000 employees, you generally have multiple sources of HR data. You probably have your HRIS system, which is your main record tracker of people, payroll, one main host of data, which probably has about 70% of the data you use to analyze and assess people. But then there's several tangential systems. You might have a talent management system separate that does your performance, your succession planning, things like that. You might have a separate recruiting system that also has siloed data that you're then bringing in. So the way to get a holistic look on this, we'll show a couple of aspects of this, is how do you then take all that information, put it onto one platform so you can use it all together, as opposed to having to use it in siloed different systems. And then there's the external data you might bring in. Some of the typical ones in human resources are external benchmark data. You might want to compare your turnover versus the turnover of other companies in your industry. Or particularly big is salary data, being able to find out, what are people getting paid in certain positions in certain locations in the country, so that you may think you're paying somebody well, but if they're 20% beyond below what everybody else is making in that position, that area, you may have some trouble down the line in being able to keep that person. So once you've brought all this data together, you're able to form models. So the data is given to you in snapshots over time, and then you can sort of take it, project it, and look out into the future and say, where are things going right now on the current path? We do this via a lot of graphically rich dashboards to show both the trending and the visualization of all your key metrics. But the key is that it then goes into our machine learning AI engine, where it can then develop self-learning algorithms that'll adapt as more data comes in. And you'll kind of see about this as we kind of talk about the next slides as to what's gone on in the last month, in the entire world, and particularly the business world. But once you have that data processing, you can then make decisions or changes based on, is my trend going in the wrong direction, and what can I change to make it go in the right direction? And that's what we call prescriptive modeling. So all that being said, we've had a lot of changes here in the last 30 days. There's a couple of quotes, both on March 6th from different areas. But so March 6th, today is the 26th, so 20 days ago, a third of people in the US were working remotely. That's obviously changed a lot as companies have pushed almost all of their knowledge workers, at least, home to remote officing. And the unemployment rate was at an all-time low of 3.5%. So in 20 days, with the onslaught of this horrible virus and the how companies have had to adapt. Now these are just two statistics that have changed drastically in the last 3 weeks. So if you look at it from the standpoint of the key areas and metrics that companies and vendors have been focusing on, go back to February when we were in a bull market. You had retention, recruiting, productivity, engagement. Retention, it was all about limiting attrition, keeping people from leaving your company, particularly your high performers, being able to find your high performers, make sure that they're engaged, productive, you're taking care of them so that they don't leave to a very very tight job market as it was in February. Recruiting, companies just could not fill their open positions quick enough. Recruiting technologies and softwares were going through the roof because companies just aggressively trying to hit those targets. One, just trying to fuel their growth that they were experiencing, and also trying to fill the positions of the people they were losing to competitors. And from productivity and performance, really the idea was, if you're not getting enough performance, throw more bodies at it, and that kind of fed the recruiting. Companies were continuing to hire more, and they can get that increased productivity by just hiring more people. And then engagement, of course, has been very key to companies for a long time, just based on the thought that happy people perform better and they stay longer. So these are kind of the 4 areas companies have been focusing on, but it changes a little as you move from possibly the bear coming out of hibernation and slowing things down a bit. This one may be an artificial one that came through, again, the current health crisis that's going on, but nonetheless, it's going to have an impact on the economy. So looking at the same 4 metrics there, retention is going to be changing a bit. Companies are probably going to have to lay people off, so there's going to be fewer seats at the table. And it may even be so drastic that you have to cut into your high performers. Definitely as companies, you don't want to lay off your high performers, but if the downturn hits so fast, that's something companies might be faced with. Recruiting, except probably for a couple of key industries of delivery, there's pretty much been shut off, a big decline in recruiting. Productivity, as there always is in a downturn, companies are going to try and do more with less, and that's going to fall on the shoulders of the employees that remain. And engagement, there's a whole different aspect there with, possibly 90 to 95% of your company working remotely. You have to reach those workers in a way that might be more difficult than you did when you had 70, 80% of your workers at the office, around their colleagues and around management. Let's look at each one of these just a little specifically. First, let's talk about retention. One thing that hasn't changed is to really know who your high performers are, because you're going to have to make some tough decisions at this point if you have to do layoffs, and making sure that the high performing individuals in your company, who they are, and hopefully they don't get thrown out with the bathwater, or whatever the analogy is, that they're at least the last ones if necessary. But it's very important to identify who your high performers are as things are happening very quickly. For one reason is you might have high performers in a position that just isn't needed anymore for the next couple of months, Do you let them go, or do you maybe try and reallocate them to another position where they stay with the company for a while, and then as things get back to normal, you can put them back into that position where they were, highly productive. And then also from a financial standpoint, being able to visualize your organization and see, before you start laying off staff level high performers, are there executives maybe who can go without compensation for a while or something, so they can ride out the storm and keep more of your people going forward. So a couple of things to consider on the retention stand front. From recruiting, as I mentioned, definitely certain industries are just are doing okay, but most companies have pretty much shut down all their recruiting right now, and are not hiring even for critical positions just till they see exactly what it is we're facing here. But this is also a good idea, kind of pivoting back on the retention and how it goes with recruiting. If you don't have one, it's a good idea to have, particularly for large companies, an alumni community where you keep track of your employees, try and keep them engaged with the company, even if you've had to let them go, particularly your high performers. Because if you can keep them engaged and keep them high on the company, often when the economy snaps back, those are the first people you're going to want to go and get. So being able to keep a community where you're in touch with them, and then being able to hire them back, hopefully when the economy snaps back in a month or two. We refer to these as boomerang hires. People, it was unfortunately that they had to leave, but that you're able to bring back quickly as things improve. Productivity, for the people who remain, it's always gets a little more difficult because more is thrown on your shoulders. And what we've seen historically, particularly even coming out of the last Great Recession, companies were slow to hire back. So if this is a prolonged recession, again, companies might get more hesitant to do things. People are probably going to be, employees are probably going to be burdened with, more job tasks than they were, a month ago, and that's, possibly going to be something that continues. Also, productivity. Looks like GoToMeeting is working pretty well today for this session, but with more people working from home, I don't know if many of you have. I've seen a little bit of degradation in the performance in some of the tools that we use. And also just doing conference calls with people remotely. There's a lot more chance of interference and things not being caught that don't happen. So that can impact productivity. But also you're gonna have to probably look at doing some cross training as well, being able to teach some of your employees, maybe those high performers in one industry. If you move in one position, if you move them to something else, for the meantime, you're gonna have to train them on how to do those particular jobs. And then finally, the whole engagement aspect of people working from home. So some people are great at it, and you really gel at being able to work from home. Some people, and I probably put myself in that category, are more persons that like to work around people. And but regardless of the standing, it's going to be harder to reach people. So the idea of keeping them more engaged, involved in their work, because particularly in these times where facing things we may not have faced, at least in our lifetimes, people are understandably scared, and getting messages and hearing from the company and corporate leaders is absolutely key. Having communication as regular as possible, getting information out there goes a long way in keeping people engaged and into their jobs, and not sinking into possibly depressed states or anything. And something that might make a little bit of a renaissance here. I came from the talent management sphere a couple of years ago, and there was a big spike in something called gamification. In order to engage employees more, they put little games or contests linked to what employees were supposed to be doing to get them to use certain tools and stuff. And that's possibly something that might make a return here as more people are working remotely, and particularly those that haven't been used to it, to get them to use maybe more of the tools they didn't necessarily have to use when they were on-site employees. So with all that, technology, dashboards, visualization can help in a lot of ways. We'll talk a lot about the storage, the data aspects that we talked about in the beginning, but we'll also look at some of the new metrics possibly that you can use from the same data that you have in your systems today that might help you navigate again this current crisis. The visualization, we'll talk about how much easier it is to work with something when it's visualized than as opposed to having to kind of print out a report and deduce it from various columns of spreadsheets, and particularly something that there's certain looks that everybody wants to have, but the ability to create and configure your own dashboards and visualizations can go a long way to helping people even further do their job more effectively, particularly even in a remote environment where you just have to be able to do what's particular to your job. So with that, I'm going to move just quickly to a demonstration here, and hopefully everybody can still see my screen. Has a number of tiles on it with different vendors. So the key thing, as I talked about earlier, is being able to bring in all your relevant data sources. And to the point I was mentioned earlier, most of the data sources you have are going to be structured data sources. When we do an implementation of a people analytics system, we're almost always bringing an HRIS system, an ADP, a PeopleSoft, SAP, UltiPro, Workday. And then we move to other systems like your talent systems, your SuccessFactors, iCIMS, Greenhouse, JobView, Cornerstone. And those are all your internal key data systems. You can tap into those by an application programming interface or an API, or you can use down here, which is an FTP site. Companies tend to go back and forth whether they want to do an API and all the trouble that might entail, or do they want to just flip a file every once in a while to a site that then can be uploaded. You can also, as I say, bring in external data like salary data from salary.com to do the comparisons. Bureau of Labor Statistics always has some good comparative turnover rates and even utilization rates. And you might bring in survey data from SurveyMonkey or some other ones like Qualtrics or Glint and companies like that. You can also bring in that data, so you have the most holistic view of your information. And once you have all that data in the system, you can build out your data library. Oh, the one thing I didn't mention is you can also bring in just strict legacy data. Trend data allows you to bring in just data from a flat file that you can upload in the system, either by itself or to augment some of that data that you have brought in from other systems. And once you do that, you can then go around and build out your dashboards. So here, for example, is a dashboard that might be built out for an HR manager, which might be more robust than other individuals. We talk about some of your best hire sources, turnover over the last couple of months. I do want to warn you that we update our data for our demos every month. So this data is going to have data that's through the end of February. So it's not actually going to highlight some of the things that I talked about, but I do have some separate metrics that I'll talk about in a minute here that are more relevant to the current environment. But yeah, so you can track your turnover. You can look at it and splice it by different ways of looking at it: high performer turnover, separation type, and you can even narrow that down if you wanted to use separation type and maybe by a particular filter. So separation type maybe just for your VPs and above. Then you could have a turnover rate which is granted a lot smaller. And then one thing we offer, which has always been a very a unique from Trend Data, is our predictive modeling. So I can then say, if this is the way things are now, what are they going to look like if nothing changes? And obviously a lot changed, but if I go forward into the predictive model here, it was basically telling me that turnover was going to go up and plateau here in March before start trickling down. You can move from your individually filtered view to one that shows maybe some higher level statistics. And then you can also have what we introduced as our predictive panel, which can show you, what are the factors that have been affecting turnover? How much you pay people, where are they working from? Are they remote employees? And what kind of professional development are you offering? So this is saying that salary hasn't really had a big effect on turnover in the last couple of months. We can actually bear that out. As I click to this modeling, you can actually see some future statistics that I can play and see if that's in fact true. So right now I'm paying about $122,000 as an average salary at this company. It's a bank, a lot of white collar workers. So if I change that and give everybody a $5,000 raise, right now turnover is about 5.73%. If I increase that by 5,000, it basically brings turnover down only about 0.2 of 1% in the first month, and then leaves things alone. So according to this model, and it's been borne out by the modeling, that hasn't really proven to be a great turn. So I can actually reverse that. Similar to the industry, I got about a third of my population working from home. So people obviously like doing that. If I increase, say, that by 10%, you can see that does start to drive turnover down even more. But if I wanted to go specifically, say, after high performers, and not just everybody, the model is telling me that I should focus on professional development. And right here you can see I've got less than 7% of my high performers are in any kind of professional development. So I can actually maybe take some of that money from salaries and put it here, maybe switch this to 15%. And you see that goes specifically after the high performer attrition. And the model recommends that you continually increase that because it's having a very positive effect. So we can build out models like this for pretty much any, whether it's retention, recruiting, whatever. And we can build the system so that it's user defined. So for example, you can have several types of users with the trend data system. So you can have someone described as an administrator, which means they can see everybody. You can have someone who's a standard user who can see only from their point down in the organization. Or if you want, you can actually build out user-specific roles that might be, for example, if you wanted to create an HR business partner role, and that person might perhaps only be working with people in the state of New York, and maybe you don't want them to see executives, so you might also make it just staff level people. And once I've identified those, I save that profile, and now if I wanted to add another user, I can I have that profile stored in my system so that I can create a user with very defined privileges. So wanted to spend a little time on that, but I did want to also pivot to look at some metrics that again kind of more relate to what's going on today. So I created actually a separate dashboard, actually a separate system that had a lot of the typical metrics on it, but also talked about some of the things that you might want to be looking at in today's environment as you're planning your organization, hopefully for the next 2 or 3 months, but if it has to go longer, maybe finding out just how able is your organization ready to work remotely right now. So in this particular environment, as by the end of February, where we had about a third of our workers working remotely, and we anticipate probably moving to 90–95%. You find that about 20% of your population doesn't have laptops. They only have desktop computers, which might be difficult to just haul off and bring home. So that's something you might have to address. Other things you might need to be able to track of some of your disabled employees, whether they might need assistance or if they had special workstations at the office that enabled them to do their job. And if you're moving those people to home, you might have to understand what that is and either help out or possibly expect less from them because they don't have the tools and things like that. So a couple of things to consider. There's also, as I talked about, the workforce reallocation aspect, where you're looking at, again, this is a, a bank, and banks have a lot of tellers, or it's a big part, and this is like 30% of their workforce. So those people are, obviously in a lot of environments, retail environments, they're being told to work home, so they can't really be doing their jobs as tellers or branch executives. But over here, you can see that the company did have a large number of open admin roles that they were hiring for. So maybe you can move some of these people over here for the time being, give them a place where they can be productive, and you can also compare salaries to see if it's adequate move and compensation. But that's just one suggestion. You could have all sorts of analyses done here on positions and relocations. The one I talked about a little bit was the idea of, if you have to let people go, what can you do both for them and for yourselves when you're letting them go? So here's an example where you have a high amount of high performer attrition that was going through the last 6 months. And if you have an alumni program, and I talked about one client we work with, partner we work with in Sala, who has a really good alumni offering, where you can actually engage and keep in touch with your employees that you've let go. So if they register as alumni, you're able to keep them in the fold, communicate to them, maybe do events along the way as you're trying to get them back up to being involved in the company again, and knowing where those high performers are. Because if you're forced to let a high performer go, the first chance you have, you're going to want to hire them back, and being able to see where they are, have them engage is really key. So in this instance, you can see that of our high performers, we've got about 50% they're in the alumni program, the 4s and 5s. But once you go below that, it's much less. So you might want to consider who you want to keep in the how aggressive you want to be with the program. Another aspect is, the more revered companies in the industry, try to provide career transition services for their employees as they move throughout the company, so move out of the company. So being able to know, if they've registered for career services, and being able to see, is being registered for career transition more helpful to people getting new jobs than not so. Being able to track these statistics are very useful. As I said, we have one company that we work with who does this, but we actually know a couple in the industry as well. And then the final one, which could be viewed as being a little more socialist, but being able to visualize, or at least the decision-making team being able to visualize, who actually can bear a recession better than others. Most companies tend to start down and start letting go of people down here, but is there a chance that maybe some of the people up here might be able to go without at least cash compensation for a period of time, or would they be willing to trade off and maybe take stock or stock options in turn? Whereas if maybe you have a significant percentage of deferment up here, you could then apply it down here and maybe not make these layoffs so tough. So a couple of things to consider going forward. The dashboards, the visualizations can help you keep track of these, whether it's ours or somebody else's. So I do want to encourage at least trying to use something like this as you make these very important decisions in the next probably 30 days. So with that, I am going to go back to the presentation and open it up for questions. So Jonathan, looked like we had a few come in.
Yes, we did.
Okay.
So, and I just also in a message there in the chat box, I don't know if everyone has that chat app open, but I just wanted to encourage everyone that if you don't want to share your identity, you can certainly click the everyone box and send a question directly to either Tom or myself, and we'll be happy to not disclose your identity. For example, someone said, do you offer connections to more systems than were in the demonstration? Because we have Ceridian.
Yes, absolutely. That was just a sampling of ones that we've worked with in the past, but definitely Ceridian. And a lot of systems, most of the major systems, have the API interfaces, so they're very easy to connect to. But yeah, we've worked with more than were on that list. That was just kind of a representative list. But yeah, if it's a data system, we can plug into it.
Okay. And kind of hearkening back to the beginning of the webinar where you were talking about the different structures of data, this question is, how often do you work with customers who have unstructured data they need to import into your system?
Probably the extent to it. We haven't really worked with many who've used voice, but we have worked with quite a few who've tried to integrate emails into the system where they want to tag it on to certain things or be able to pluck out keywords from emails that they can apply to engagement and performance type statistics. I'd say it's somewhat small, but we do have those that have asked us to do that.
Okay, good. This one, it kind of made me smile because I've heard it before. Is HR data really considered big data?
Well, I kind of got into that when I was going through with big data. In the industry, I'd say it's probably considered big data. I would say it's kind of semi-big data because you don't have the volumes that you have, and most HR implementations use 90% internal data, some outside benchmarks and stuff. We're using internal data, it tends to not quite be big data. As I said, usually dealing in gigabytes as opposed to terabytes and larger. So I'd say it's semi-big data, mostly becoming from the size of the fields. And that's good because most of the data is structured, and probably the velocity of the data, and that it's not changing quite as often. But that all could change, as systems become more dynamic going forward in updating employee records.
Right. Here's just a couple more here. This person asks, how does the predictive AI work in the software?
Well, essentially, what the system does, it has a learning engine in it that can take as much data as you put into it and calculate algorithms based on historic paths. So, if you have, even just limited, tenure, salary, time in position, maybe commute distance, it can generate a pretty good model based on what it's seen happening. The more elaborate you can get, as the one I showed that showed remote work, professional development, things like that. We've had a few clients that use it that actually calculate the weather patterns, like in Southeast Asia, as to whether people can get to work as a part of their model. So it can be as robust or simple as you want it. I'd say the key is less how many metrics you have to put into it than how much history you have. Generally, if you need about 3 or more years of history to have an accurate model.
That's incredible. And then someone asked specifically about the alumni software and if you have any recommendations.
Yeah, there's one particular that we work with, which I talked about, is Insala. They have an excellent alumni package, and they also do have career transition services as well. So that would be one that I'd recommend. There's probably a few others out there, but we've done most of our work with them.
Okay, well, unless any other questions from the audience, I'll just give it a quick breath here if you want to type out something.
And I don't know if somebody asked this, but we will share the deck to anybody who wants it. So essentially, let's see. If you email it to marketing@trenddata, I think that'd be a good one, right, Jonathan? You can man that.
Of course.
Yeah, so we'll send you the deck. Feel free to follow me if you want, or email me if you have a question or something directly. You can follow me on my Twitter handle, and I do have a personal blog, tommckeown.net, if you want to read some of the articles I've written in the past. Of course, Trend Data, we've got our Twitter handle and our website at trenddata.com. We have a really big content library that has a lot of these recorded webinars, blogs, white papers, case studies, industry pieces that, you know, again, as you're trying to make some of these tough decisions here in the next couple of months, nothing wrong with getting a little more knowledge on them. And so we have a good library, as well as pieces that we recommend that we don't necessarily produce. So with that, I think I would like to thank everybody for showing up. And it's always good to talk to people and to present things here. So I will end the webinar here, and I look forward to speaking and talking to you all in the near future, and hopefully in better times. Thank you, and take care.